Hello and welcome to the Naru FastCast with your hosts, Dave and Josh Masson.
Pull up a chair and listen to us discussing fasting and health-related topics. How's things? What's been going on?
Good. Yeah, been good, man. Just been busy, and I wasn't actually very well the other day, but so that was sort of a bit unusual. Normally I'm pretty fit and well. So again, it's just a very gentle reminder to try and eat, sleep, and do things properly. Sometimes it's easy to say these things, and sometimes you miss them in your own doing a practice. But yeah, no, apart from that, good.
Nice. I think it's important though, because I think it's important for people to understand that, you know, everyone gets ill despite people who try to maintain the peak of health. Because I don't know why, like, this thing of like not being ill and things is this pinnacle of where we should be getting to. Like, don't get me wrong, you don't want it to happen regularly, but there's I think it's about understanding that not everyone is infallible. Do you know what I mean? This can happen to anyone despite how good health you are and things of that nature. And I think that people get injured, you know, despite taking all the precautions. People get unwell. This is part of like life. And I think sometimes there's this pressure these days to be this like utopic vision of what like other people aspire to being. And I think that's where, like, when you look at a lot of the more popular people in social media and spaces, some of them are these like utopic. Paul Saladino tries to be very much like this, I think, where he tries to epitomise what he talks about, which I think is really admirable and really commendable. But then you get other people on the other scope, which is like Joe Rogan, which is people like, yeah, I smoke cigars, I drink whiskey, like I smoke a lot of weed, but I also train really hard and I do all this kind of stuff, and he's like successful and he's healthy and all the rest of it. And I think like sometimes it's about, we need to show people that actually, you know, as healthy as you can be and are, like, we're all the same. Like, we go through normal human stuff, and I think that's really important. So it's like, it's good to tell people like, yeah, I was ill this week. Do you know what I mean? I didn't feel great. It's like, it happens to everyone.
Yeah.
But it's, I think like a lot of these problems, it's not about not getting ill. It's like, how do you respond to being ill? And like, how long are you ill for? How long does it take to recover? And then does it come back afterwards? And I think that's the difference. It's like, it's not about getting ill. It's about like, what's your response to illness? And do you recover really quickly? Do you know, does it keep coming back? And like, I see this with injury and with osteopathy. It's like, I don't mind if you get lower back pain. You're going to live in that body for the rest of your life. Like, even if we get rid of your lower back pain and get you stronger and more stable, it's like, that's still got a high chance of coming back. 85% of the population get lower back pain. I'm not interested in that. It's like, how quickly do you recover? Like, how is it coming back? And if it comes back, how intense is that? Is it coming back? And what's that frequency like? Like, those things are more interesting to me than whether you've got lower back or not got lower back pain. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's funny because I know, like, I got some people give me stick because they're like, oh, you know, look at the nutrition guy being ill. But then you're kind of like, oh, it's funny, isn't it? Because I've just done like 14, 15, 16 hour days, and I was ill for like 2 days. And you're kind of like, it also then made me realise how resilient my body was from the other aspect of being like, God, I put a lot of effort into like every aspect, whether it's the kids, it's my marriage, my friends, my work, Naru. And then you have that sort of downturn. But it is, I think there is that sort of aspect of things, is that I think very much the physical health, we do also forget that there's the mental health, forget that it has a massive effect on the physical health. And sometimes you're very much like, okay, cool, I've got my nutrition down, I'm exercising, I'm also sort of going to sleep okay, but you're like, my mind is just not switching off. And you're kind of like, oh, okay, so that's a good thing to remember, because some things you kind of forget is you kind of go, well, it's okay, I go to bed and I'm tired after like hammering out like a whole day's work. But then you're kind of like, if that was my body just doing something all day, I would be dead.
Yeah.
Whereas my brain, it's like, oh, it's okay for my brain to sort of keep going until 11 o'clock at night, and then I'm just going to go to sleep and get up again, you know, 7 hours later and do it again. You know, you just wouldn't, if your brain was a physical body, you'd be like, hold on a minute, you must want to actually relax that a bit, mate, because that's going for it, you know. But you just don't go, oh, I need to switch that off, or maybe I should do some meditation before I go to bed. And you kind of get out of those practices because your mind's quite resilient, and you know, and if you're quite driven, it's like, oh, that's fine, it'll be fine. And yeah, I just think that capacity for you know, you see it, don't you? I think it comes in, you know, I find it with the kids, you know, I put a huge amount of effort into my boys, and And I just find that the times I kind of know that my mental capacity is going down is when I find I'm out doing stuff that I normally really enjoy, like taking down the woods, for example, and I'm like, they want to play a game with me, but it's just really annoying me. And I'm like, why is it really annoying me? And then you kind of day goes by, and the day carries on. You kind of go, oh, it's really annoying me, and you kind of go, right, maybe she's actually have some downtime, take some time off. Not, do you see what I mean? And sometimes we don't pick up on the little cues, and I think that's what I've been guilty of last week when I was ill for 2 or 3 days. It's just those constant little reminders that you kind of, when you sort of get out of touch with the body.
Yeah.
You go, all right, yeah, I probably should have listened about 2 weeks ago to that.
Yeah. Well, they say that. I think you gave the quote about Johnny Wilkinson. That there was X number of signs of injury that
he said, and I said this to a patient the other day actually, because he had 14 injuries in a row, and then he had almost a career-ending injury on his shoulder, and he said, when I reflect on that, he said that my body was telling me 14 times to stop or to slow down, and he's like, all I kept on doing was thinking my body's getting weaker and weaker, so I need to train harder, I need to do more physically. And he was like, actually what I did is I think he took a period of time out before he went to lose, and then he said, I just came back and played the best rugby in my life.
Yeah, it's so interesting actually. On that note, really, as well, I know we're going on a tangent, but I think it's really interesting that I had someone talking about the other day about is in relation to lower back problems and surgery, and he was like the world leading. He's kind of at the moment the kind of world leading expert in lower back pain and solutions thing. That's called Dr. Stuart McGill, and he's kind of done all the research around back pain and everything else. Is fascinating. Anyway, he was saying what's really interesting is when it comes to surgery, and if people come to see him and they're like, I think I need surgery, he's like, well, look, before you do surgery, it should always be the last resort, right? Because it's kind of organised trauma. And he was saying what you should actually do is do what he calls I think it's called a virtual surgery. Because his kind of stance is that the surgery itself, when people get positive results from surgery, from a musculoskeletal perspective, it's not always about how effective the surgery was. It's actually what the people do in the recovery that's important. And so he was like, if you can just, in your brain, pretend you've just had surgery on your lower back. And he was like, what are the things that you would do if you just had surgery? It's like, well, you'd probably rest more. You probably would, do you know what I mean? You'd probably take better care. You'd probably slow your progression back to exercise. You'd probably dial back and slowly progress back towards exercise, back to physical activity. You change the way you sat and did things at work. You'd be maybe mindful of nutrition, hydration, whatever it is for the healing process. He was like, the recovery process after surgery is the important bit, not the surgery itself. And so what people do is, because of the extreme of surgery and because of the trauma and everything else, they're very careful to do these processes. And he was like, if more people would just do the recovery bit of surgery for their problem, they would have a far greater recovery without the surgery bit. And it's just, and I thought that was a really interesting way of looking at it, and kind of just going, imagine if I did go through this, what would I have to do differently? Okay, I probably have to scale back my exercise. I probably have to do a little bit less at work. I probably have to ask for a bit more help and doing that. And I think it's so interesting that if we took some of that approach, but we have to have that extreme thing happen to us. It's like people have to have the health scare to be able to change their health habits. It needs to be almost extreme enough to create, there needs to be enough action potential to be able to push us into action and move forward. But I think if we kind of took some of these concepts forward, I think it would be really interesting how different we would be.
And I think sometimes it's because it's difficult to find where to start. Someone reached out when we said there's not a golden bullet, but there's lots of silver BBs. And someone reached out the other day and said, oh, that really resonated with me, the way that you said that, because I sort of taking from that sometimes we might find that it's the certain diet, it's the fasting, or it's the sleep, or it's this one thing, and then you hammer that to death, and then you go, oh, well, it's not really having the same effect anymore, so then you stop it. And I feel like a lot of people, but then you kind of go, surgery sounds like it's going to fix something, and a bit like you were saying, it's the same thing over and over again. 90% of disease states caused by our environment, and 10% is caused truly by genetics. And you kind of go, that's because people want to have something to fix it, and then they don't do anything about their environment. It's a bit like, when diabetics come in, get their diabetic meds, but they carry on with the same lifestyle and don't change it, and then you just get this escalation of polypharmacy that goes up to the roof. But I think it is, you're right. I have the knee. I've got tears I had an MRI, and I've got cartilage tears all over the shop. Went to see a surgeon. He was like, we'll do an arthroscopy and pay privately to go and see him, because I was in the middle of my half Ironman training and I could barely walk. Went to go see physio, and they were like, do you know what, if you were focusing on your running style, changing your trainers, making sure that we're concentrating on above and below the kneecap strength and mobility. And she was like, I don't think you need anything. And I went from being able to barely walk for 3 months to finishing a half Ironman like 6 months later, and touch wood, not having knee problems, because I kind of remember what she said about focusing, and a bit like you were sort of saying that preventative kind of thing. And when I get my knee pain back again, I'm like, right, I got the squats and the lunges and all the types of things that I was doing before, and it just sorts the knee back out again. Don't know.
Yeah, I think there's a really great saying, going back to talking about genetics, which is like, genetics load the gun and your environment pulls the trigger. And so I think it's one of those things, it's like, a loaded gun in of itself has the potential to be dangerous, but without someone to pull that trigger, it doesn't become dangerous until someone does. And I think that's sometimes the thing, is that we look at genetics and we see that people have a certain propensity towards disease states, or towards patterns of health or ill health based on their genetic makeup. But understanding the importance that isn't you're not kind of like predetermined down that road. It's like there's actually a lot of factors that will end up pulling that trigger that then maybe causes those genes to activate, and then disease process to go down that road. But I think that, like you said, that if we don't understand how in control we are of our environment and how much we control our disease states and stuff. So really, really interesting. Cool. Nice.
Cool. Right. Yeah. So podcast, I mean, I've kind of got a topic which I think is interesting, because it's going to have to require some nuance, because it sounds very clickbaity, and it kind of is, but like Josh was saying, you kind of have these camps that take these to extremes. So you're probably aware that Josh and I have a more of a predominant sort of animal-based type of diet. Again, anything that you hear or you listen to or you read, again, it's good to implement it to you and see if that affects or helps you or optimizes you. And I think for both of us, I've never done a vegan diet like you have, but I have done vegetarian, eating meat once a week. I've never done full carnivore like you have, but for me, that kind of where I sit now with my diet seems to be the best that I've sort of felt and been. So there is an element of also sort of I hear a lot about anti-nutrients, and I thought it was quite an interesting topic, because there is some people that talk about sort of plant food as anti-nutrients, and there are some foods that do affect the absorption of nutrients, and I just kind of wanted to just sort of chat about them, because it is quite interesting to think when you go and make food, looking at the balancing of that food. It's quite an interesting thing. But I think at the end of the day, if you've got the choice between a salad with like smoked mackerel on top or a burger, the burger is the anti-nutrient. Like, do you know what I mean? I'm going to talk about sort of, oxalates, things like this, which they can sequester nutrients. But in general, if you have the choice, or if your preference is, I prefer a salad, or I'm going to have a burger tonight, or a pizza, that is the anti-nutrient in the room, basically. So basically, and sort of these things that animals have, they're sort of kind of a bit like plant defense chemicals, and some are used to protect against insects breaking them down. Some are used to sort of store minerals, and others, just when they come into our body, they can become irritant. And actually, when they've looked at certain studies, they found that there isn't a huge difference really for people like vegans and vegetarians to omnivorous people, that that eat obviously huge volumes of what you'd call anti-nutrients. However, what it does do is that when I was reading this from the Harvard School of Human Health, they were saying that the other problem is that if you combine these anti-nutrients together and you eat quite a lot of them, then and you're doing other things on top, or you have a deficiency, it's probably worth being mindful about these foods. And I thought I'd do a self-experiment for this podcast, and I do not, but I love peanuts. I mean, I could go wild on nuts, and they just do not agree with me. So I was like, okay, I'll think about this. It's got tons of oxalates in them, and I know I'm sensitive to them. So I ate a load of nuts, and I had stomachache all night, and I had about 3 or 4 days of abdominal pain. And I was like, that's definitely a thing. Do you know what I mean? I was like, it's good to talk about it, because there is some stuff. And, you know, I used to take bags of nuts in with me to work. And I used to think it was, and again, some people might eat nuts and they're absolutely fine, but it's just about putting it in context. So a couple of them, so Goitrogens, for example, so cruciferous, things like broccoli, cabbage, and they basically interfere with the absorption of iodine. And iodine is obviously important for your thyroid and things. So again, you know, there is that mindful thing, is if you have hypothyroidism, or you have, you could be borderline, it's something that you might want to, you know, if it's in your diet a huge amount, I mean, you're not probably going to have broccoli every day, but it's just something to be sort of a bit more mindful of. And it's interesting that you can eat a food that then impacts the absorption of other food. And, you know, it's that thing of a plant is very clever. You know, if you have a broccoli and you eat the stem and then you eat the seeds, they combine to make it like a gastric irritant. But if you eat the seeds on its own, they usually don't give as much gastric distress. So it's little things like that. Lectins, so legumes and sort of peanuts and whole grains. And whole grains actually seem to be a real nuisance for absorption of other minerals and vitamins, which is ironic because it's in everything. You know, they say, you know, eat whole grain this, whole grain that. But, you know, calcium, iron, zinc, phosphorus, things like that, the absorption of those are clearly reduced. And that kind of is a problem. If you've got a whole grain, you know, we just talked about broccoli, you know, if you've got whole grain kale and then you've got beans, then you kind of think, well, each of those are going to affect the absorption. So although you are giving yourself a nutritious meal, you know, it is just being mindful about how many of those things you kind of lump together. So oxalates is one thing I'm just going to get into a little bit later, because oxalates, I find, for me, are things that they do actually have an effect. And oxalates are in quite a lot of things like kiwi. They're there to sort of, they think that they're there to basically, as a mineral storage kind of capacity. So they sequester sort of things like calcium and things like that in the leaf, but they can also be there to protect against fungi and insects and things like that. So, you know, magnesium, zinc, calcium especially, copper, they can all kind of, because what they basically do is they're an irritant in the body. So a bit like a ketone in the sense of, which is why you get the keto flu. The ketone is a negatively charged body after ketosis, and the body wants to get rid of it, but it can't go through the kidney if it's negatively charged, so it adds a electrolyte to it, and then that makes it neutral so it can be taken out. Same thing with the oxalates, they're kind of negatively charged, they need to make an acid so the body can get it out with the kidney, and that by partnering them up together, the body goes, right, okay, well, we need to add something to it, so let's take some calcium here and stick it together, and that's where you get the kidney stones from, if you're obviously having them in high volumes. So phytates, so again, porridge, you know, my kid Rupert loves porridge, and it's about being mindful, you know, about sort of how often you give that to them. It's not to say, you know, you've got the beta lectins in them and things like that that are important for sort of cholesterol stabilization things, but again, they can reduce the absorption of iron, zinc, magnesium and calcium. So you kind of go, okay, just being mindful of that as well. You know, tannins in tea and things like that. So again, you know, the nuance around it is that yes, you can mitigate that, because obviously, like I said, the proportion of these deficiencies in vegetarians, omnivores and vegans isn't that dissimilar. There's slightly more in the vegetarians and vegans, but because obviously you can potentiate against them by cooking them. So, it is just being mindful that the irony of these things is I haven't mentioned one meat in that. And again, it kind of does potentially highlight the value of good quality. Obviously, if you're having a sausage versus a grass-fed, grass-finished steak, those things are kind of day and night.
Yeah.
Because they're processed. So so the oxalic acid thing is something quite interesting. I've sort of heard a lot about it, and there's, like with everything, our body is in a real balance, and it kind of does need us to be working together with other sort of departments in our body to bring this balance. And when we find that certain things dip down, other things can rise back up again. So for example, in the case of oxalates, we make around about 25 milligrams of it in our body a day. Okay, so we're used to using some. They don't really know why we create it, because it's a toxic byproduct. But what we do, though, we're very good at chelating, so we're connecting a mineral to it and then putting it into the bowel or the liver or the kidney and then getting rid of it. Okay, so the problem is that if you were to have like a spinach smoothie with chocolate in it, and you were to have some almond milk in it, because almonds are a nightmare for sequestering minerals, blend that up and drink it, we produce about 25 milligrams, and we can usually handle up to about 100. But then a lot of people that are doing these smoothies, you're having like 750 milligrams of oxalates.
Jeez.
Which is like an oxalate bomb, basically, that people like are drinking on a regular basis. And you sort of think, okay, if you're doing that regularly, you do have to be mindful of like how much you're actually getting in, and it comes back to sort of the balance thing. So oxalates become even more of an issue if your level of B6 and magnesium in the body goes down. So if you have lower volumes of magnesium and B6, your capacity to turn oxalates into and to basically detoxify them goes down. So it is mindful, I think, about being that, because again, you talk about brain fog, knee problems. It's amazing how certain things can really affect other parts of the body that you don't really associate with them.
Yeah, for sure.
So like with the nuts, like obviously that's a direct sort of gastric thing. But then ironically, my knee was playing me up, and I was like, on reflection, when I was sort of looking into this, I was like, actually, could that be a really high oxalate stress that I had in my body? Could that have been due to that? You don't know, because obviously it's very difficult to test for these things. But again, as we were saying before, being in tune and being mindful of all things that are going on in your body will help you, but hopefully, to try and make good decisions with your diet and your health and things like that. Because sometimes the devil is in the detail, and if you are cooking something up and you've kind of got all these things in together, it's worth being sort of mindful about the effects of them, really. And again, you think about sort of high oxalate foods: seeds, nuts, beets, chocolates, blackberries, almonds, potatoes, kiwis. And then we discuss low oxalate foods, meat, dairy, avocado, eggs, cabbage, mushrooms, cucumber. It is just mindful that if you are having knee pain, you've got oxidative, so you've got inflammation, you're having problems sleeping. You could do a number of things, but if you're having loads of these things in your diet, because obviously the precursors for sleep and for dopamine, for serotonin, for all these different neurotransmitters used in your brain, require minerals that these products prevent absorbing. So either you kind of go, maybe I'll take some out and cook with different things and see whether they make a difference. But it's just being aware of that. And I just thought it was quite interesting.
No, really interesting. And I think this is a really fascinating topic. And if I can add some context a bit more, only because it's an area that I enjoyed looking into as well. But I think like framing it like you did at the start was really good, which is that ultimately I don't think there's any contention that humans are unequivocally omnivorous.
Yeah.
Right. And so, yes, we may have a slight kind of favouring towards animal-based products just because of their high calorie and nutrient density. with regards to the amount of effort and time that goes into hunting them, getting them, and having a massive resource. I think ancestrally speaking, we were omnivorous, but we had a predominantly animal-based diet from that perspective. However, we plant foods. I think that nowadays people have tolerances that vary within that scale. Some people do amazing on a carnivore diet, some people thrive on a vegan diet, and most people fit somewhere in between that. Okay, so I think what we're talking about here is that the dose makes the poison.
Yeah.
Right. In that eating some spinach isn't suddenly going to give you really bad, calcium oxalate crystals in your kidneys or anything of this nature, or start depositing in your thyroid. It's going but if you have a sensitivity to oxalates and you are hammering down spinach smoothies and eating loads of dark chocolate and stuff like that, then you might need to start thinking about these things, and you might have a sensitivity to some of these anti-nutrient kind of phytochemicals that plants produce. And I think that's the next thing to understand, is that plants don't want to be eaten, right?
Yeah.
And animals can have claws and teeth and wings, and they can fight back or run away or whatever it is. Whereas plants aren't like that. Plants like being buried in the sand up to your neck, and that's you for the rest of your life, right? And so ultimately plants need to defend themselves, right? And plants want you to eat the fruit of their tree, because what happens is you eat the fruit, and hopefully within that the seed then, because it's cased in a hard shell, will hopefully survive your digestive tract. And then what happens is you go and take it somewhere else. It passes through your digestive system, comes out in a pile of fertilizer in an area that's somewhere else from the parent plant. So there's no competition for nutrients. So that makes sense, right? Which is why part of the problem when it comes to seeds and nuts and stuff like that is actually the grinding, the chewing. If you think about wheat and stuff, it's the milling of those products that's problematic, because you break down that coating and any anti-digestive enzymes that are in there. Because what the plant wants you to do is, seeds are like the reproductive part of the plant, right? So it's like plant babies, not to overly personify them, but it is in essence. And so if you're going to put it anywhere, you want to put the most amount of kind of anti-digestive enzymes and anti-nutrient enzymes into those areas, so that the animal that eats them, chews them up, goes, God, I'm not going to go back to that plant because that was horrendous. A little bit like you were saying, like I think sulforaphane, for instance, is something that's found in broccoli that people talk about as being a really good thing, right? Because it stimulates your body's own antioxidants. Well, sulforaphane doesn't actually really exist. What ends up happening is, as you bite down into the broccoli seed, two chemicals combine to create sulforaphane, and that creates an inflammatory response in the human body. Now, that inflammatory response is what we often term as hormetic. Right?
Yeah.
So it's a chemical hormesis, which means that there's a small amount of a negative stimulus, which then causes the body to do something positive. So you have the sulforaphane from the broccoli, that causes your antioxidants to be released to help to reduce the oxidative stress that's being caused by that, and that's a positive response, right? And people like Ron Patrick, who we're a big fan of his stuff, is very a high proponent of that because of his activation, which is fine. And so that's what I mean. It's not that these things are all bad, and that just having one bit of it will cause you to have problems. It's going, if you continually eat these things in very large quantities and you're not feeling great, then you should probably have a look into these things, because I think we're told that plants are great, they're this free pass, that you can eat as much or as one of them and no harm will come to you. And that's not always the case for everyone, right? And as much as there's the flexibility and variability along the spectrum of meat to vegan, or meat to or animal-based to plant-based, there is also a sliding scale of tolerance to all of these foods. And same again, some people really don't digest red meat very well. And that may just be because the enzymatic function of not eating red meat, because they don't digest it well, means that every time they eat it, they don't digest it very well because there's not the enzymatic function there, and therefore it just reconfirms the bias of, oh, I can't eat it. And that would be the same for everything. You don't eat anything for long enough, your body will become less adaptive at eating that. Lectins, things of that nature, are known as insect paralyzers. Again, these are all things that they're designed as phytochemicals to protect the plant, and that's all that's happening. Now, we've bred out a lot of the toxicity from plants through huge kind of human selection of making sure we pick the right ones, and then we've found favourable ways of cooking those out, so like kidney beans and stuff. We all know that if you eat enough raw kidney beans, you can die. I think it's lysine that's in those. But anyway, cooking them for a high enough temperature for long enough gets rid of that. So, like you said, there are ways of making this, and I think what we're really talking about here is if you are someone who is fit and healthy, who has an optimal diet, who is thriving in life, but maybe there's a few areas that you're not feeling quite as good. You get a bit of brain fog, you get a little bit of lethargy, or your joints ache and stuff of this nature, but you're still trying to do a lot of things, and then maybe look into this. I think if you're someone who's struggling with weight, if you're struggling with body composition and doing this, like this is the kind of stuff that you probably don't need to worry about at this tide. Like, figure out what the right balance. If you get to a place where you're, maintaining a healthy lifestyle and a healthy nutritional balance, then look into these nuances.
That's so true.
Enough.
Yeah.
And then just the final thing on this note, because I actually had a patient that I spoke to about this week about this, because he's getting loads of GI problems, and a lot of IBS type stuff, and he was saying that he's tried, like, in the past it was doing really well, and now it's got worse again, so he has to do things like cut out caffeine, because that's for him is aggravating. But he favours into a more vegan, plant-based way of eating, and that's fine. And I was trying to explain to him that basically carnivore and vegan are really great for if you want to go into those worlds, and typically as diets of elimination.
I was about to say,
because what ends up happening is by going to the extremes, you cut out so much that could be inflammatory and aggravating, that it leaves you with just going, okay, I can rebuild other things into this now that I've separated them. Now, carnivore is more of an efficient elimination diet, just because it's such a basic process of kind of protein, fats, amino acids, all the rest of the stuff that goes with it, that because of these phytochemicals that exist in plant foods, it's far easier to be eliminative and then restore your nutritional balance through going that way. I think there's a little bit more convolution when it comes to from the vegan perspective, but I think either end of the spectrum works great as elimination diets. So this patient of mine favours towards plant-based, so I was like, great, go there. But he said that after he's vegan for long enough, he then starts getting the GI problems again eventually. So even though initially it helps to resolve them, after a while it starts to come back. And so he was obviously very despondent about this, and was quite unhappy because he thought, I was finally getting control of it, but it's coming back. And I had this exact conversation you've just had, which is going, well, typically when we go towards certain extremes of diet, we find ways of eating certain things, and we typically eat a lot of them, right? So if you are going towards a vegan diet, there will be certain vegetables within certain families that you enjoy eating more than others. And so I was saying to him, right, well, when you get to that point, when you start eating, if you are starting to feel that gut disruption come back, think about all of the plant foods that you're currently consuming, and think which family, and that's part about educating them, which families there are, the brassicas, there's the nightshades, there's all the rest of it. You're kind of going, right, which family are you eating most?
Yeah.
What are the kind of phytochemicals that exist in that family? What are the symptoms you can get from that? And does that correlate with what you're experiencing? If it does, you go, okay, well, maybe it's just you're just eating too many. The dose is equal, dose makes the poison. So it's not that you shouldn't be eating any of them. It's just you get to a point where you're eating too much of them. It's accumulating in your system, a little bit like the oxalate bomb you explained. It's a bit like that. You're getting this phytochemical bomb that's going off for you because of the accumulation of it. And it's not that you shouldn't eat any of it or stop eating them. It's like dial it back, because we know that an accumulation, you have a threshold, like an action potential, whereby once you go over that, you start getting symptomatic. And so I think hopefully that kind of reframes all that great stuff.
Yeah, Brett, you really well, yeah.
But into the other context, which is understanding that some people deal as more or less sensitive to these things, and it's about all of this stuff. It's about becoming cognizant of it.
Yeah, 100%.
And I think not dismissing the fact of, eating this salad or whatever, that's not affecting my knees, or it's not affecting my brain fog. And it's like, well, it could be. And really great examples of people in celebrity-wise is Miley Cyrus and I think it's Liam Hemsworth.
That was one of the things I looked into. Yeah.
Who are both people who stopped vegan diets because of high oxalate issues, which I think were causing thyroid and potentially kidney problems for both of them. And even a patient of mine recently who went and got his kidney stones removed. They said his kidneys were like a gravel pit, which I think is a horrible thing to think about. But he was told to avoid spinach. Yeah, for exactly the same reason, is that it's very high in oxalates and kidney stones are calcium oxalate crystals. just a bit of a weird one.
Nasty,
But no, I just
yeah,
thought it's an area that I also find interesting, so I kind of want to grab in on there and just chuck in some content. You obviously went for more of the high science side of things, which is fantastic, but I think we just need to be mindful of these things, right? And if you, hopefully that frames things in a little bit more perspective. And I think there's so much information that you can go and find around these different bits, but like my wife, she could tolerate a lot of the nightshades, which a lot of people can't do. Like tomatoes, peppers, chilies, white potatoes, aubergine, all those things.
Is it potato? I didn't know
white potato is in there as a nightshade. So, and it might be some of those you can handle and some of you can't. You can't just go, well, I respond negatively to tomatoes, so I'm going to cut out the whole group of nightshades. It might not be like that, but peppers for her and tomatoes. So the other side of things, if you really want to get really into the weeds, is deskinning, deseeding can sometimes be a beneficial thing. Now it's a lot of effort, but if there's a particular thing that you enjoy eating but you know you might be a bit sensitive to it, skins and seeds are likely where a lot of those phytochemicals exist. So just, if you're a cucumber, if you've got whatever, skin and deskin, deseed, because the flesh is not really the element that's the issue here. It's both the protective part on the outside and the reproductive part on the inside. It's why if you look at a lot of fruits have stones. If you crack open that stone, there'll be a nut inside. That's what a cashew is, right? A cashew is actually a nut of a fruit plant. Same with like almonds and peanuts. Like a lot of people don't realise that these nuts are actually encased in reproductive part of other things. So hopefully a bit more food for thought there.
Pretty good, mate. Yeah.
Nice. Cool. So my topic was a little bit different today. I'm going down the exercise route. And the reason for that is that I think it's an area that's kind of not talked about. People know about it. And it got popularised during COVID, which is, for people that are watching this, I have in my hand a resistance band. And that's resistance band training. And I think it's something that's fantastic. I mean, you do a lot now,
you got
right?
me into it.
So I love doing it. I don't do it as much anymore, but I got really into it during COVID or during the lockdown period, as I'm sure most people did. But it was during that period of time that I was able to then actually research into it. And I think that it'd be really great for a lot of people because you can do some really, as you know, and you do, really quick, effective workouts with not a lot of equipment wherever you want and get a really great result from it. You put on like a lot of weight and a lot of muscle recently and you're not going to the gym, like you're just doing resistance band workouts, right? And so it's proof, but I want to kind of contextualize why that might be the case. Now, when we talk about resistance band training, what we actually want to start thinking about is less about the bands, but more about linear variable resistance. Now, what that basically means is, with this band here in front of me, is linear variable resistance means that as I stretch it and pull it, the band and resistance gets stronger. And as I come off, the band gets weaker. Now, that's it sounds really simple, but it's really, really important. If I take this bottle here and make this act as my fixed weight, right? This bottle with the fluid inside has a fixed weight to it. Let's say it's 1 kilogram. Now, I'm just going to do, for people that are listening to this, a shoulder press, right? So the bottle is next to my shoulder. My hand is like I'm about to press this over my head. Now, as the bottle is next to my shoulder, my joint is now in the weakest position here, right? And my muscle is also in the weakest position. As I press up, my arm gets stronger. So some research has shown that you're up to 7 times stronger at the top of a movement than you are at the bottom, which is why people like to do press-ups just at the top. It's why people don't like to do full depth squats. I'm not advocating either one is important, but the reason is because people like to work the stronger part of the movement opposed to the weaker part of the movement. So what does this mean? Well, when I start this lift, because the weight is down by my shoulder here, this is in the weakest position. I can only lift a weight based on how strong I am in this weak position. So if I can lift this kilogram from here, that's great. Maybe I got to 4 kilograms, 5 kilograms. Maybe when I get to 10 kilograms, I can't lift it from here. But if someone helped me through that, I'd probably be able to lift the 10 kilograms at the top, but not at the bottom. And so most lifts, when it comes to weight, we can only load our muscles with the weight that we can lift in the weakest position. And so the muscle is that's why we have to do lots of sets and reps with weights, because we have to accumulate that resistance over time to be able to fatigue hopefully all three ranges of movement. We have both the strongest range, the middle range, and the weakest range. Now, how does that differ to resistance band training? Well, the good thing about resistance band training is if I hold this band in my hand in the same position as before, I'm in my weakest position here. My joint's weak, my muscle's weak. As I get stronger and push up, the band gets stronger, right? And as I come down and get weaker, the band gets weaker. So what ends up happening is the band gets stronger and follows the natural strength arc of my muscle. And what that means is as I get stronger, the band gets stronger. As I get weaker, the band gets weaker. So I overload my muscle and deload my joint. Because as my muscle gets stronger, the band gets stronger to overload the muscle. But as my muscle gets weaker and the band gets weaker, so it helps deload my joint. Whereas with a fixed weight, as my muscle gets weaker, the pressure on the joint is still the same. Okay, and my ligaments and everything of that nature is still the same until I get to the weak movement, which is why failure training with weights can sometimes be dangerous from a joint perspective, particularly if you do it frequently enough. And it's because you are continually fatiguing a muscle with a weight that's going to be the same weight in that weak position for your joint. So band work really effective for that exact reason. We overload the muscle, we deload the joint. Now, if we want to use failure training when it comes to resistance band training and linear variable resistance, then I can go to failure safely. And the way we need to think about this is I need to be doing my full reps. And the first thing I want to feel like I've fatigued is that top range, that strong range. And as I failed that, I come down to the middle range and I'm pressing. And as that range fatigues, I get down to the lower range. And I'm really just trying to get out the last few movements until that's completely fatigued. Now, I should, hopefully, only need to do a few sets. And if some people, when you get this right and you understand failure training, you can get to the point where you only need to do one set and that's it. Because you fatigue that muscle in all of its ranges, whilst for its strongest, its middle and its weakest, deloading as you go, and therefore the damage and the hormetic response that you've created in that area, it's not necessary to keep doing more because you've done enough because you've hit muscular failure in its weakest position. If you want to continue doing more, I don't think there's anything wrong because you're training relatively safely with a deloading of the joint, overloading of the muscle. So that's really important. The reason being it's important is we think about longevity. If you could think about people who are wanting to keep training but they worried about getting injured, or they're not enthusiastic enough about going to the gym to risk getting injured, they're getting a bit older, or actually they just don't enjoy going to the gym, they don't have the time, resistance bands are a great effort for doing that. A lot of the research is really, really stunning when it comes to variable resistance, because resistance bands aren't the only way you can do this. There are actually gym machines, which are very rare, I've never seen them, but you could get like a pec deck. The machine itself has variable resistance to it. So as you move it or push it, the resistance gets greater, right? And it's fantastic. It's a great way in commercial gyms to be able to use this concept.
Yeah.
The other thing that people use is chains. So you put chains on a bar, and then obviously as you lift the chain, more of the chain comes off the ground, it adds more weight. And so chain work is again another version of variable resistance. Resistance bands seem to be the easiest way to do it at home. But there's so much research out there showing that the strength gains and hypertrophy gains from doing this are really, really profound. Dr. Andy Galpin talks a lot about the strength gains in this, but they also did a study at, I think it was Michigan University, and they got different athletes from all different classes, so American football players, basketball players, netball, female netball players, Olympic lifters, all together in randomized group. And one group trained for 6 weeks using fixed weight on the squat, deadlift and bench, and then the other group trained using variable resistance for 6 weeks on those same lifts. And what they found is the people in the variable resistance, they found that the bench went up by 2 times, but the squat went up by 3 times more in strength for the variable resistance compared to the people who are using fixed weights. Now the reason for this, and if I could stand I'd show you, but if you think about a deadlift, if this band as a circle, right, I've got one of the bands they're not like the thin bands that people put around their legs for like glute exercises. This is like a longer, thicker band. As it stands, let's say this has 5 kilos of tension, 10 kilos, just so I don't embarrass myself in my maths. So there's 10 kilos of tension around here. Okay, and that means that if I just stretch it like this, at the very maximal point, there's 10 kilograms of resistance, right? If I now do this, right, and pull like that, I've now essentially doubled that resistance,
Yeah.
right? So here there's 10 kilos, here there's 20 kilos, and then there would be maybe 80 kilos or 40 kilos if I pull apart. And so what's really interesting is that if you get one of the green bands, which I think has got the maximum side is around about 60 kilos of tension, and then you fold that in half, what you've now got is up to 120 kilos of tension in that green band. Now, I can take that green band, stand on it with it folded in half, and just start doing deadlifts with it. Standing on it, with
Yeah.
my hands on the band, doing deadlifts. What's crazy about that is at the top end of that, you've got 120 kilos worth of tension at the top range of that. But because it scales at such a slow rate, as I'm getting stronger, the band's getting stronger, it means that I can just step into this and lift up to 120 kilos of tension onto my muscles. Because you've got to remember that the muscle doesn't know if you're lifting a weight, you're lifting a log, you're lifting a resistance band. It's just responding to tension and stress and mechanical loading. And so resistance bands, if used correctly, which means that you are picking a weight that's typically between 15 to 30 repetitions, you are fatiguing all of ranges of movement throughout that journey. You can have profound levels of weight through tension going through your muscle in your body that you never would have normally lifted, but safely, because as you get weaker and that muscle can no longer take that strain, the tension and resistance reduces.
It's so good. Since you introduced me to it, it's been a game changer, because you can sandwich in such a small... I mean, I've never been able to maintain weight by doing the shortest amount of exercise. It is just phenomenal.
Yeah.
It's so good.
It's really good, and you can get like a great pump from it, so you can get great metabolic changes from the training itself. And like I said, if you want to, you can just do one set on each exercise. Now, if you're going to do that, my thing to you would be there's certain different protocols you can use where you can split body parts. But that way, what you can do is like a 10-minute body workout where you target certain muscle groups, and then the remaining muscle groups get targeted the next day. And then what you do is you just keep replacing. So you do three days of one set of muscle groups, 3 days of another set of muscle groups, and you can just cycle that. That's what I used to do during lockdown. And so then you have 1 day rest.
Yeah.
Now, the reason you can do that is because each workout should take you about 10 minutes if you're going to absolute failure and you've got the resistance band that's of the correct weight. And the question is, well, how do I know when to go up in resistance band? Well, you know if it's too heavy, it's because you can't get 15 reps with it. Clean, good reps. And if it's too light, it's because you're going above the 30, 40 range.
Oh, I don't do that, so that's good, actually. That's good to know.
Yeah.
I don't... I treat it as if you would... I just don't do enough reps, actually. And I've also forgotten about the 3 different stages of failure. Yeah. So that's really good, actually.
So it's really, really important because if you want to put muscle on, volume is what you need to grow muscle. If you want to build strength, it's intensity. Okay, so if you are someone who wants to use resistance bands to put on a bit more muscle and get a bit bigger, you are going to have to be pushing towards more of the 30 range. And what I used to typically do was try and make sure I hit 15 at least with my clean, like very good form, clean ranges of movement going through the high, medium and low. And then afterwards, I would just count how many reps I would get as I burn through each range, and they're becoming like half reps. That's fine. And I would just count those as I went. But what my main goal always was to get 15 clean reps to know the weight was right. And then everything else additional, despite the range of movement reducing, got better. So you can do this for anything you do. But deadlifts are great because deadlifts typically have a really skewed risk reward because people don't deadlift properly and they put too much weight on the bar and they don't have enough lower back stability to be able to cope with it. But deadlifts are one of those things where there's a huge risk reward ratio. So the risk of injury massively outweighs the reward of the exercise. And there's so many other exercises you could do to target those same muscle groups, which would be beneficial. But when you use resistance bands, the thing changes because the deloading effect as you go up as you come down, and the overloading effect as you go up, means that actually you get all the reward with very little risk through that. And it's not no risk, because every exercise has risk to it, but it's really, really interesting. Okay, so if you're someone who's listening to this thinking, I'd love to get into resistance training, because we know, and I don't want to go into it, but resistance training is one of the best things you can do. If you listen to anything that Peter Attia talks about, who's the kind of, he's a medical doctor in America, who's like the go-to guy when it comes to lifestyle, longevity, quality of life, stuff of that nature. He talks about how smoking and obesity have a 3x increased chance of all-cause mortality. So if you smoke and you're obese, you have 3 times more likely to die from other things that you might experience in your life. Resistance exercise has a 5x reduction in all-cause mortality. And so it's if you're someone who's thinking, I'm training well, I'm fasting, I'm getting good sleep, I'm maybe doing a lot of cardiovascular exercise, and I'm doing all the things I should be doing, but the one thing I'm missing is resistance training. Resistance bands is a great way of getting into it. You don't have to go to a gym. You can just take 10 minutes out of your day. You and I have got a bar that you can get from Amazon, which is like £80. It comes with the bands as well, and it mimics an Olympic bar. And that's a fantastic way. It's got carabiners on the side or clips on the side that you can clip the bands into. You can do everything you would normally do in a commercial gym with a barbell safely in your own home. You can do 10-minute workouts every single day for 6 days a week, get great results based on what it is you're trying to achieve. And that might be the catalyst for people to start resistance training in a safe way that's enjoyable, that doesn't take up too much time, that they can then improve that area of their health and well-being with. So I think that's mainly... Do you have any questions on that? I don't know if I missed anything.
To be honest, I'm just sat here getting educated. It's really helpful for me, because I'm like, okay, I'll take that, I'll do that, I'll do that. Yeah.
No, it is really important, and there's so many different exercises you can do with them. My one caveat to you is this, and this is what I found through training actually anecdotally. Try not to train it like you would a normal weight. Because of that variable resistance, you won't have this... So with a dumbbell, I have a fixed stimulus on that muscle, right? And so that it's being overloaded for the entire movement the same. Resistance bands aren't like that. Because I get weaker as it gets lower, it will be considerably less weight on that band as you're at the bottom part of that range compared to the top. So if you are just doing 12 reps and stopping, the chances are, if you actually looked at the weight you've lifted, it's going to be insignificant compared to what you would have lifted with a dumbbell. Okay? Yeah. Because it's just not, there's not a fixed amount of weight. Okay. So what I would implore you to do is fatigue all 3 ranges of movement. Now you don't have to get to absolute failure or where it's becoming painful or you're going to create damage, but make sure that you've exhausted that top range of movement, whether it's a press out in front of you, whether it's you're squatting and you're getting to the point where, you're at the top part, you're kind of not quite getting there and you're only coming up to 90 degrees, then you're getting to the point where you're barely lifting off. Whatever it is to you that you want to do, try and fatigue all 3 ranges of movement, because otherwise I don't think the stimulus will be great enough. There is an interesting chap, if you want to see one of his videos, just in terms of it explores linear resistance. I'm not saying I'm a huge fan of this guy, but he wrote a book called Why Lifting Weights is a Waste of Time, John Jacques. He's a medical engineer and things of that nature. His book is basically trying to sell his bar that he uses with his resistance bands. So you always need to take these things with a pinch of salt, because he's going to cherry pick the literature to make it favourable for all these different things, despite him saying he doesn't. But nevertheless, he does explain a very interesting routine that I followed for a long period of time, and he does explain some of the science around it. So that's the X3 bar. Now, the reason I say one of his videos is really interesting is he does hook his bar and bands up to some sort of weighted device to show you the amount of tension going through, and you can really easily see how the tension that starts off in that band as he goes to deadlift, and as he gets to the top, how much tension is now, or weight,
I've never seen
resistance
that,
is in that band. And I think it's just a really nice visual representation of the fact that some people don't realise that when you're at that top range of stretch and tension in a band, it's an incredible amount of force. And people don't realise that you're actually lifting that amount of weight. And if you went into a gym and tried to lift that amount of weight on a barbell or something of that nature, you'd really, really struggle. So I think we'll wrap it up from there for today. But I think that was really interesting.
Yeah, really interesting bit at the end, actually. I got a lot from that.
yeah, and I hope everyone else did as well.
Yeah.
Might be something to try. So let us know if this is something that interests you. A little bit more anecdotal. It's more about like what we've done. Dave's doing it right now. I've done it, but I've had a look into it. So yeah, I hope you guys have enjoyed the podcast today.
And see you next week.
See you next week.